Ma'am, if you reach for that phone again, this becomes a federal situation, the officer warned, but the strange thing was, Naomi Carter didn't look afraid at all. At 2:13 in the morning, the quiet neighborhood on the south side of Norfolk, Virginia exploded into flashing red and blue lights as 30 officers flooded the narrow residential street, like a military convoy moving into hostile territory. Rain hammered against rooftops and wind pushed dead leaves across the pavement while neighbors peeked through curtains, their faces washed pale by the spinning police lights reflecting through wet glass. Naomi Carter woke to the sound of fists pounding against her front door hard enough to shake the picture frames on the hallway wall. For one confused second, she thought the noise was thunder. Then came the amplified voice outside. Police department. Open the door now. Her 8-year-old nephew Isaiah stumbled out of his bedroom, clutching a faded gray blanket against his chest, his small eyes wide with panic. Naomi moved fast, wrapping one arm around him while the pounding grew louder. The old house trembled under the force of it. She could hear radios crackling outside, boots on wet concrete, car engines idling. Someone shouted another command she couldn't fully make out through the storm. Naomi pulled aside the curtain just enough to see armored vehicles lining the street. Officers in tactical gear stood behind open doors with rifles pointed toward her home. Her small white porch glowed under blinding spotlights. For a moment, the entire world looked colorless except for the violent flashes of red and blue bouncing across the rain. Isaiah's voice trembled. "Aunt Naomi, what did we do?" Naomi looked down at him quietly. "Nothing," she said. "That's why you stay calm." Another slam hit the front door. Harder this time. A framed photograph crashed somewhere deeper in the house. Naomi inhaled slowly and walked toward the entrance barefoot, the cold hardwood floor creaking under her steps. She opened the door halfway, and immediately bright flashlight beams flooded her face. "Hands where we can see them," a voice barked. 6 officers rushed onto the porch at once, water dripping from their jackets. Behind them stood Sheriff Cole Bennett beneath the rain, broad shoulders hidden under a black waterproof coat, his jaw tight with the kind of confidence only powerful men carried when they believed they would never be questioned. His eyes swept across Naomi's face once before drifting past her into the house. "Naomi Carter?" he asked. "Yes. We have reason to believe classified federal property is inside this residence." Naomi blinked once. "You raided my home at 2 in the morning over property?" One younger deputy smirked under his breath. Another officer pushed past the doorway without waiting for permission. Isaiah flinched instantly. Bennett didn't react. Rainwater rolled down the brim of his hat, while the neighborhood watched from behind glowing windows. "Step outside, ma'am." Naomi tightened her hand around Isaiah's shoulder. "You're terrifying a child. Step outside now." The officer's tone sharpened. Naomi slowly walked onto the porch, thin gray sweatpants darkening under the rain within seconds. Cold wind pressed against her shirt while officers spread across her front yard like they expected a war zone instead of a 60-year-old woman's house, with chipped paint and flower pots hanging from rusted hooks. One deputy whispered something to another officer, and both laughed quietly while staring at the home. Bennett glanced toward the living room, where family photos still hung crooked on the wall. "Funny," he muttered. "Doesn't look like the kind of place connected to Pentagon intelligence." Naomi's expression never changed, not even slightly, and somehow, that unsettled him more than if she had screamed. Lieutenant Travis Boone stepped through Naomi Carter's front doorway holding a flashlight like he expected hidden enemies behind every wall, but the first thing he saw was not weapons, cash, or stolen files. It was a small wooden table covered in prescription bottles labeled for military veterans. Rainwater dripped from the officers' boots onto the faded carpet as deputies spread through the house, opening drawers, photographing shelves, and speaking into shoulder radios with rehearsed urgency. Naomi stood motionless, on the porch beside Isaiah, while cold rain soaked through her clothes. The neighborhood remained awake now. Curtains had fully opened. Porch lights glowed one by one down the block, like silent witnesses waking up together. Sheriff Cole Bennett removed his gloves slowly, while watching Naomi with narrowed eyes. "You used to work federal contracts?" he asked. Naomi kept her eyes on Isaiah instead of him. "I used to help people." Bennett gave a dry smile. "That is not what I asked." Before Naomi could answer, a deputy stepped outside carrying a stack of old papers from the living room cabinet. Nothing so far, Sheriff. Mostly medical records. Another officer laughed quietly from inside the house. This place smells like mothballs and coffee. Isaiah shifted closer to Naomi, trying to hide behind her side as the officers moved through the windows like shadows under flashing blue lights. Naomi rested a hand gently on his shoulder. Her fingers were steady, even though the cold rain had turned her skin pale. Across the street, Mrs. Alvarez from number 14 stood under an umbrella filming everything with her phone. A teenage boy farther down the block whispered to his friend, "They brought a whole SWAT team for her?" Nobody understood it. Naomi Carter had lived on Mercer Avenue for almost 7 years and never once raised her voice at anyone. Every Thursday morning, she drove veterans to appointments at the Norfolk, Virginia Medical Center in her old silver Ford Explorer with peeling paint near the bumper. Every Christmas, she placed hand-knit scarves on the church donation table without writing her name on the tags. Half the neighborhood only knew her as the quiet black woman who waved politely and kept flowers hanging from the porch even through winter. Lieutenant Boone reappeared in the hallway holding a framed photograph. "Sheriff," he called out. Bennett stepped inside, while Naomi remained outside in the rain. The photograph showed Naomi standing beside 3 elderly veterans in wheelchairs under an American flag outside a rehabilitation center. One of the men wore a Purple Heart cap. Another officer searched the kitchen cabinets, moving cereal boxes and canned soup. Aside, "You really think somebody hiding Pentagon property lives like this?" he muttered. Boone lowered his voice. Orders came directly from upstairs. Bennett stared at the photo for several seconds before setting it down. Something about the house bothered him now. Not because it looked dangerous, because it did not. The walls were covered with ordinary things. Isaiah's school drawings held up by magnets. Grocery lists written in blue marker. A calendar with doctor appointments circled carefully in red ink. No luxury. No hidden panic room. No sign of the threat they had prepared for. Yet Bennett refused to back down. Men like him had built entire careers on never appearing uncertain in front of subordinates. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky while Naomi quietly watched officers carry boxes onto the lawn beneath floodlights. One deputy accidentally knocked over a flower pot near the porch steps. Dark, wet soil spilled across the concrete. Isaiah looked down at the broken flowers and whispered softly, "Those were my mom's." For the first time all night, Naomi closed her eyes. The moment Sheriff Cole Bennett saw Naomi Carter close her eyes beside the broken flower pot, he mistook her silence for surrender, and that was the first real mistake of the night. Rain continued falling in thin silver sheets across Mercer Avenue, while red and blue lights painted every house like a crime scene. Officers moved in and out of Naomi's home carrying cardboard boxes, laptops, old folders, even Isaiah's school backpack. Lieutenant Travis Boone stood near the front lawn speaking into his radio with the sharp confidence of a man enjoying the attention. "Sweep the upstairs again," he ordered. "Check attic access and crawl spaces." Naomi slowly opened her eyes and looked down at the crushed flowers scattered across the wet concrete. Tiny purple petals clung to the rainwater near her bare feet. Isaiah bent slightly as if he wanted to pick them up, but Naomi rested a gentle hand against his shoulder before he could move. "Leave them," she whispered softly. Across the yard, several deputies laughed while one officer held up an old rotary phone from the kitchen like it belonged in a museum. "Maybe this is how she contacts spies," he joked. A few nearby officers chuckled. Bennett smirked without looking at them directly. He liked when his men felt relaxed during operations. It reminded everyone who controlled the scene. "People always look harmless before federal investigations," Bennett said calmly while adjusting the cuffs of his gloves. "That is why they get away with things." Naomi finally looked at him directly for the first time in several minutes. Rain rolled down her forehead, but her expression remained still. "You brought 30 officers into a retired nurse's home because somebody told you to." Bennett tilted his head slightly. "No, Miss Carter. I brought 30 officers because somebody important believes you are dangerous." A long silence settled between them. The only sounds came from police radios, distant thunder, and the wet crunch of boots moving through soaked grass. Naomi glanced toward the open front door where flashlight beams swept across family photographs hanging crooked on the walls. One deputy emerged carrying a folded American flag from a wooden display case. "Sheriff, look what we found." Bennett took the case and examined it under the floodlights. The glass was scratched with age, but the triangle folded flag inside remained perfect. A small brass plate beneath it read, Sergeant Marcus Carter, Bronze Star recipient, killed in action. Bennett's eyes narrowed slightly. Your husband? Naomi nodded once. Isaiah stared at the ground quietly. Bennett handed the case back without emotion. That still does not explain classified federal concerns. Naomi's voice stayed calm. No, but it explains why your men should stop treating this house like enemy territory. Boone walked down the porch steps holding a thin black notebook. Sheriff, we found encrypted numbers written throughout this thing. He flipped through the pages quickly. Coordinates maybe. Bennett took the notebook and glanced at several pages filled with handwritten numbers, dates, and short-coded notes. His jaw tightened immediately. Finally, something suspicious. Around them, the energy shifted. Deputies straightened their posture. Radios became more active. One officer muttered. Knew she was hiding something. Bennett stepped closer to Naomi now, rain dripping from the edge of his hat onto the notebook pages. Would you like to explain this? Naomi looked at the notebook for only a second before answering. Those are medication schedules for veterans with traumatic brain injuries. Boone frowned. Why would they need coded numbers? Because some of them cannot remember their own names anymore. Naomi replied quietly. So I built a system they could follow. Boone's expression hardened, embarrassed that several nearby deputies had overheard her answer. Bennett closed the notebook slowly, refusing to show uncertainty in front of his team. Then one deputy suddenly shouted from inside the house. Sheriff, you need to see this room. And for the first time all night, every officer stopped moving. Every officer in the house turned toward the hallway when Deputy Miller shouted. And for a split second, Sheriff Cole Bennett finally looked like a man hoping he had been right all along. Lieutenant Travis Boone moved first, pushing past the kitchen doorway while flashlight beams bounced wildly across the ceiling. Naomi stayed on the porch beside Isaiah, but her eyes followed the officers carefully as rain continued dripping from the roof in slow, uneven rhythms. Across the street, more neighbors had gathered under umbrellas now, whispering to each other while police lights reflected off puddles lining the curb. Bennett stepped into the hallway and stopped outside a narrow room near the back of the house. The door stood open. Inside sat 6 old metal filing cabinets, 2 dusty computer monitors, shelves stacked with binders, and a large wall map covered in colored pins and handwritten notes. One deputy exhaled sharply. Jesus, another officer muttered. What the hell is this place? Boone swept his flashlight across the room slowly. Coordinates, dates, names. Entire sections of the wall were covered in carefully organized charts connected by red string and handwritten labels. To the officers, it looked exactly like the kind of operation federal agents warned about during intelligence briefings. Bennett stepped farther. Inside, his boots creaking against the old wood floor. The room smelled faintly like paper, coffee, and machine oil. A silver military-style radio sat unplugged beside stacks of notebooks. One deputy pointed toward a locked gray cabinet in the corner. Sheriff, that cabinet is reinforced. Bennett's expression hardened immediately. Open it. 2 officers moved toward the cabinet, while Boone carefully flipped through a thick binder labeled case notes. Every page contained detailed records with military abbreviations, medication references, emergency contacts, psychological evaluations, and coded annotations beside dozens of names. This is encrypted, Boone whispered. No, said a quiet voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. Naomi stood there now beside Isaiah, water dripping from the sleeves of her sweatshirt onto the hallway floor. Nobody had noticed her walk inside. It is protected, she said calmly. Bennett stared at her. Step away from this room. Naomi ignored him and looked directly at Boone instead. Those files belong to veterans suffering from severe trauma. Men abandoned after deployment. Some cannot remember where they live. Some wake up screaming every night. Boone glanced back at the binder in his hands. Suddenly the pages looked less threatening, more human. Bennett noticed the hesitation instantly and stepped in before control slipped away. Then why keep military communication equipment? He demanded. Naomi's eyes shifted toward the old silver radio. Because some of those men disappear when they stop taking treatment. Sometimes I have to find them before they hurt themselves. One deputy near the cabinet shook his head. That still does not explain federal authorization. Naomi looked at him quietly. You assume you understand what federal authorization looks like. The room went still. Rain tapped softly against the back windows while red and blue lights flashed through the blinds in slow pulses. Bennett walked closer now, lowering his voice. Listen carefully, Miss Carter. Somebody from Washington flagged your address personally. That does not happen by accident. Naomi held his gaze without blinking. Then maybe you should ask yourself why they sent local officers instead of federal agents. Bennett opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, one of the deputies finally forced open the reinforced cabinet. Metal groaned loudly through the hallway. Everyone turned at once. Inside were rows of sealed military folders stamped with faded clearance labels, dozens of military service photographs, and one small black satellite phone sitting alone on the top shelf. The entire room fell silent. Boone stared at the phone first, then at Naomi. Sheriff, he whispered carefully. That is not civilian equipment. Bennett slowly reached toward the phone, but Naomi's voice stopped him cold. Do not touch that unless you are prepared to explain yourself directly to the Pentagon. The moment Naomi Carter warned them not to touch the satellite phone, every officer in the room hesitated. But Sheriff Cole Bennett made the second fatal mistake of the night when he decided hesitation looked too much like weakness. Rain continued tapping against the windows while the old house glowed under rotating police lights outside. Lieutenant Travis Boone stared at the black phone resting inside the cabinet as though it might suddenly come alive in his hands. The device looked old, scratched along the edges, nothing flashy or modern, but the silence surrounding it felt heavier than anything else in the room. Bennett stepped forward anyway. You do not give orders here, he said coldly. Naomi remained near the hallway entrance beside Isaiah, her posture calm despite the chaos surrounding her home. Water still dripped from her sleeves onto the hardwood floor. I was not giving an order, she replied quietly. I was giving you a chance. One deputy shifted uncomfortably behind Boone. Another officer muttered, Sheriff, maybe we should contact federal before. Bennett cut him off instantly. We already have authorization. He reached into the cabinet and picked up the phone. The reaction in the room was immediate. Not panic. Worse, recognition. Boone looked away first. One older deputy near the doorway slowly removed his gloves as if suddenly aware his fingerprints were everywhere. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Isaiah tightened his grip on her hand. Bennett turned the phone over once, examining the small faded military seal stamped near the battery compartment. Looks like old junk to me. Naomi opened her eyes again. That phone was issued through Department of Defense clearance protocols after Kandahar. Bennett laughed under his breath. You expect me to believe a retired nurse carried military clearance? No, Naomi answered softly. I expect you to learn the difference between a retired nurse and somebody the military never fully lets go. The room fell still again. Rainwater slid down the back windows in crooked streams, while flashlight beams reflected off metal cabinets and stacks of files. Boone swallowed visibly now. Sheriff. Bennett ignored him completely and pressed the power button on the satellite phone. Nothing happened at first. Then a faint electronic tone echoed through the room. Several officers exchanged nervous looks immediately. Naomi's expression never changed. Bennett smirked slightly, holding the phone up almost mockingly. What exactly happens now, Miss Carter? Secret agents drop through the ceiling? A few deputies laughed nervously, but the sound died quickly. Naomi stared directly at him. No. Now there is a record that you activated a restricted communication line without federal clearance. The confidence on Bennett's face flickered for the first time. Small, brief, but real. Boone noticed it instantly. So did the others. Then the satellite phone began ringing. Nobody moved. The sound itself felt unnatural inside the quiet house. Sharp, mechanical, deliberate. Bennett stared at the screen. Incoming encrypted line. One deputy whispered, Oh my God. Naomi spoke calmly. Answer it. Bennett looked toward Boone as though expecting support, but Boone avoided eye contact entirely now. Outside, thunder rolled across Norfolk while neighbors stood frozen under umbrellas watching shadows move through the glowing windows. The phone kept ringing. Once, twice, 3 times. Finally, Bennett pressed accept and lifted it slowly toward his ear. The entire room listened. For several seconds, nobody on the other end spoke. Then a deep male voice cut through the silence with terrifying calm. This is General Elias Ward. Identify the officer currently inside Naomi Carter's residence. Bennett's face lost all color. The room stopped breathing. Even the police radios seemed quieter somehow. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the shattered flower pot, still visible through the open front door. Her voice remained almost gentle when she finally spoke. "Sheriff Bennett," she said softly, "you should have left the phone alone." The silence after General Elias Ward spoke felt heavier than the storm outside, as if the entire house had suddenly dropped underwater and nobody inside remembered how to breathe. Sheriff Cole Bennett stood frozen in the middle of Naomi Carter's hallway holding the satellite phone against his ear while rainwater dripped slowly from the brim of his hat onto the hardwood floor. Around him, deputies lowered flashlights without realizing they were doing it. Lieutenant Travis Boone stared at the military folders scattered across the table, his face drained pale beneath the flashing red and blue lights bleeding through the blinds. The voice on the phone remained calm, controlled, dangerous in the way only powerful people could be when they no longer needed to raise their voices. "I asked you a question, officer." Bennett swallowed hard. "Sheriff Cole Bennett, Norfolk County Police Department." A pause followed, long enough for everyone in the room to hear the storm outside again. Then came the next sentence. "Why are you inside Ms. Carter's protected residence?" The word protected landed like concrete inside the room. Boone looked at Naomi immediately. One deputy near the doorway quietly took a step backward. Bennett forced himself to stand straighter. "We received federal notice regarding suspicious classified material." General Ward answered instantly. "From who?" Bennett opened his mouth, but no answer came out. Because suddenly he realized something terrifying. The warrant had moved through channels too quickly. No federal agents had arrived with them. No Pentagon liaison had ever confirmed the operation directly. Somebody higher up had pushed local law enforcement into a situation they clearly did not understand. Naomi stood silently beside Isaiah while water from her soaked sleeves gathered near her feet in tiny reflective pools. She looked tired now more than angry. Tired in the way people looked after surviving the same mistake from others too many times. General Ward continued speaking. "Sheriff Bennett, Naomi Carter holds active federal protection under Defense Intelligence Contingency Authority. Her residence, records, and communications are restricted under national security protocols." Every deputy in the hallway went completely still. One officer near the kitchen slowly removed his tactical vest, as if it had suddenly become too heavy to wear. Bennett's voice dropped lower. "Sir, nobody informed us." Clearly, the single word carried enough disappointment to empty the air from the room. Outside, neighbors continued filming beneath umbrellas while police lights reflected across rain-soaked pavement and shattered flower pots near the porch steps. Inside, the confidence that had fueled the raid all night collapsed silently. Boone rubbed a hand across his face and looked toward Naomi again. "You worked intelligence?" he asked quietly. Naomi finally answered him directly. "I worked recovery operations after overseas deployments. Missing personnel. Psychological extraction. Civilian coordination." Boone glanced at the military files surrounding them. "Those veterans," Naomi nodded once. "Most were forgotten after they came home. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody smirked. The house no longer looked suspicious under the flashing lights. It looked personal, human. A place built by somebody trying to hold broken people together quietly while the world ignored them." General Ward's voice returned through the satellite phone. "Effective immediately, all officers are to leave the property. Internal affairs and federal review teams are already en route." Bennett closed his eyes briefly. Rain hammered harder against the windows now, washing blue and red reflections across the walls in trembling waves. "Understood, sir." Then General Ward said something that made Bennett's hand visibly shake for the first time all night. "And Sheriff, when you entered that house tonight, you did not interrupt a criminal operation." Another pause. "You interrupted one of the most protected civilian assets this department has ever worked with." The line disconnected. Nobody moved. Naomi slowly walked past the officers into her damaged kitchen, where cabinet doors still hung open and papers covered the floor. She picked up a broken coffee mug from beside the sink and quietly placed it into the trash. Behind her, 30 officers stood in complete silence listening to the soft sound of rain and realizing their careers had just begun to disappear. By 3:41 in the morning, the storm above Norfolk had begun to fade, But inside Naomi Carter's house, the damage left behind felt heavier than the rain ever could. Officers moved differently now. Slower. Quieter. The same deputies who had stormed through rooms with tactical confidence barely made eye contact as they returned boxes, photographs, and folders to their places. Lieutenant Travis Boone knelt near the living room table, carefully stacking military records with both hands like a man suddenly aware he had touched something sacred. Nobody spoke above a whisper anymore. The police radios had gone mostly silent after Internal Affairs announced their arrival time over encrypted channels. Outside, the neighborhood still watched from porches and windows. Cell phone cameras remained pointed toward the house, but now the whispers spreading across Mercer Avenue sounded different. Earlier, people had watched with fear. Now they watched with disbelief. Sheriff Cole Bennett stood alone near the hallway, staring at the wall map covered in names and colored pins. Under the harsh white flashlight beams, the room no longer resembled a conspiracy operation. It looked like years of quiet rescue work. One pin marked a veteran found wandering near train tracks in Richmond. Another marked a former Marine reunited with family after disappearing during a psychotic episode outside Atlanta. Beside each name, Naomi had written small notes in blue ink. Likes peppermint tea. Afraid of fireworks. Call daughter every Sunday. Bennett swallowed slowly as he read them. Human details. Gentle details. Not the records of a threat. The records of somebody carrying other people's pain because nobody else would. Behind him, Isaiah sat wrapped in a blanket on the living room couch, while Naomi quietly cleaned broken glass from the kitchen floor with an old broom. Her movements stayed calm despite the destruction around her. Cabinet doors hung crooked. Family pictures leaned cracked against walls. Rainwater from dozens of boots had stained the carpet dark near the entrance. Yet somehow the quietest sound in the house remained the scraping of Naomi's broom across the tile floor. Boone finally approached her carefully. Ms. Carter, Naomi continued sweeping. The veterans in those files, they trusted you with all of that. Somebody had to stay when the government stopped calling, she answered softly. Boone looked toward the hallway where deputies were now removing equipment from the house under the watch of Internal Affairs investigators arriving outside. Black sedans with federal plates lined the curb beside police cruisers. Men in gray jackets stepped through the rain carrying folders and sealed cases, while local officers suddenly avoided cameras altogether. One deputy quietly removed the patch from his tactical vest before reporters could photograph him. Boone lowered his voice. General Ward said you saved lives overseas. Naomi stopped sweeping for the first time. For several seconds, she stared at the rain sliding down the kitchen window. War leaves people behind long before the battlefield does, she said finally. I just refuse to forget them. Boone looked down at the floor. Shame settled visibly across his face now. We should never have come in here like this. Naomi studied him quietly. No, she said. You should not have. In the hallway, Sheriff Bennett watched the exchange from a distance, while two Internal Affairs agents questioned officers one by one beneath flashing emergency lights outside. Earlier that night, he had walked into the neighborhood feeling untouchable. Now every passing minute stripped something away from him piece by piece. Authority, confidence, reputation. One of the federal investigators approached him holding a tablet. Sheriff Bennett, your department. Access has been temporarily suspended pending review. Bennett stared at the investigator in silence. Around him, several deputies lowered their heads. Nobody defended him. Nobody spoke. Across the room, Naomi finally finished sweeping the broken glass into a dustpan. Then she walked slowly to the porch and looked out across the street where frightened neighbors still stood under porch lights and umbrellas, watching her home glow beneath police floodlights. Her voice remained calm when she spoke, but every officer heard it clearly. People like you always arrive believing fear makes you powerful, she said quietly. But fear only works until the truth walks into the room. And nobody in the house could look her in the eyes after that. The first hint of sunrise had not yet touched Norfolk when the black government SUVs finally pulled away from Mercer Avenue. But the damage left behind in Naomi Carter's home could still be felt in every room like cold air after a storm. The floodlights were gone now. Most of the police cruisers had disappeared. Only a few remained parked quietly near the curb beside Internal Affairs vehicles while exhausted officers signed statements beneath portable lamps. The neighborhood had fallen silent again except for distant thunder fading toward the coast and the soft hiss of rain dripping from gutters. Inside the house, Naomi stood at the kitchen counter carefully pouring hot water into chipped ceramic mugs while Isaiah slept curled beneath a blanket on the couch. His small sneakers still rested near the front door exactly where he had kicked them off hours earlier. Lieutenant Travis Boone remained near the dining room table holding his cap in both hands. He looked nothing like the confident tactical officer who had stormed into the house earlier that night. His uniform was damp, his shoulders heavy, his eyes unable to settle anywhere for long. Naomi slid one mug toward him without speaking. Boone hesitated before accepting it. "You do not owe me kindness after tonight," he said quietly. Steam rose between them in thin silver lines beneath the dim kitchen light. Naomi leaned against the counter. "Kindness is not something people earn," she answered softly. "It is something you choose not to lose." Boone lowered his eyes into the coffee. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The old kitchen clock ticked steadily above the refrigerator while rain tapped gently against the windows. Then Boone finally asked the question that had haunted him since General Ward called. "Why stay here?" Naomi looked toward the living room where Isaiah slept peacefully despite the wreckage surrounding him. "Because this neighborhood remembers people everybody else forgets." Boone frowned slightly. Naomi continued quietly. "When soldiers come home broken, most places stop seeing them after the uniform disappears. Here, people still wave at them, still ask if they ate dinner, still notice when they disappear for too long." Boone glanced toward the wall map again. The colored pins suddenly carried different meaning now. Not classified operations. Rescue missions no newspaper would ever print. "General Ward said you were protected," Boone said carefully. "But you never used that protection." Naomi gave a faint, tired smile. "Power is safest when nobody sees it." Outside, Sheriff Cole Bennett stood beneath the remaining police lights while internal affairs agents removed his service weapon and badge inventory for formal review. Reporters had begun arriving near the end of the block now, cameras glowing beneath the fading storm clouds. Bennett stared toward Naomi's house from a distance, but he never stepped onto the porch again. Earlier that night, he had spoken to her like she was insignificant, disposable, just another frightened black woman living in the wrong neighborhood. Now he looked like a man realizing the difference between authority and integrity far too late. Boone watched him through the kitchen window. "He built his entire career on control," Boone murmured. Naomi wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "Men who need fear to feel powerful usually collapse the moment fear stops working." Boone nodded slowly. Then he reached into his pocket and carefully placed something on the kitchen table. The crushed purple flower from the broken pot outside. Soil still clung to the stem. Naomi stared at it quietly for a moment before looking back at him. Boone cleared his throat. "I found it near the porch." Naomi gently picked up the flower between her fingers like it was fragile glass. Her expression softened for the first time all night. "Thank you," she whispered. Boone gave a small nod and stepped toward the doorway. Before leaving, he paused once more. "For what it is worth, Miss Carter, some of us are going to remember this night for the rest of our lives." Naomi looked down at the broken flower resting in her hand while Dawn slowly began turning the rainwater outside silver. "Good," she said quietly. "That means it mattered." 3 weeks later, the last police cruiser disappeared from Mercer Avenue just after sunrise, and for the first time since the raid, the street finally sounded like a neighborhood again instead of a battlefield built from fear and flashing lights. Children rode bicycles past puddles drying beneath the Virginia heat. A mailman whistled softly while pushing letters into rusted boxes. Somewhere farther down the block, somebody played old jazz music through an open garage door. Life had returned quietly, but not everything had gone back the way it was before. Sheriff Cole Bennett resigned 2 days after federal investigators released preliminary findings regarding the operation. Lieutenant Travis Boone had testified voluntarily before Internal Affairs and requested reassignment from tactical operations. Several deputies faced suspension. The body camera footage leaked online anyway. Millions of people watched armed officers storm the home of a quiet black woman who had spent years helping abandoned veterans while carrying secrets even the Pentagon respected. But Naomi Carter never gave interviews, never stood behind microphones, never appeared on television. Every reporter who approached her house received the same calm answer through the screen door. "The story is not about me. It is about what happens when people stop seeing each other as human beings." By late afternoon, Sunlight poured warmly across the porch where Isaiah sat repainting a new flower pot bright purple with messy, careful strokes. His tongue stuck slightly from the corner of his mouth as he concentrated. Naomi knelt beside him, pressing fresh soil gently around new lavender plants, while summer wind moved softly through the hanging wind chimes above them. The broken pot from the night of the raid sat near the porch steps now, repaired carefully with thin golden lines filling the cracks. Isaiah looked up suddenly. "Aunt Naomi?" "Yes." "Were you scared that night?" Naomi paused with dirt still against her fingertips. Across the street, Mrs. Alvarez waved from her porch while carrying groceries inside. Two veterans Naomi had helped years earlier were mowing a nearby lawn together slowly beneath the afternoon sun. The whole neighborhood felt different now, softer somehow, more awake. Naomi brushed soil from her hands and looked at Isaiah carefully. "Yes," she answered honestly. "Very scared." Isaiah frowned slightly. "Then why did you stay so calm?" Naomi smiled faintly and touched the side of his face. "Because being calm does not mean you are not afraid. It means fear does not get to decide who you become." Isaiah thought about that quietly while cicadas hummed in the distance. A black government sedan rolled slowly down Mercer Avenue and stopped briefly near the curb. General Elias Ward stepped out wearing plain clothes instead of dress uniform this time. Older now, tired around the eyes, but smiling gently. Naomi stood as he approached the porch. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. They did not need to. Some histories become too heavy for words after enough years pass. Ward glanced toward the repaired flower pot beside the steps. "Looks better than before," he said softly. Naomi followed his gaze. "Broken things can still grow." Ward smiled at that. Then he reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small sealed envelope stamped with a federal insignia. Naomi opened it slowly. Inside was a formal notice restoring lifetime protection clearance for all veteran recovery operations under her supervision. At the bottom, beneath signatures and authorization codes, one handwritten sentence stood apart from the rest. "Integrity does not depend on status." Naomi stared at the line for a long moment before folding the letter carefully. Wind moved gently through the porch again. Somewhere down the block, children laughed. Ward nodded once before walking back toward the sedan. No salute, no ceremony, just understanding. Naomi sat back beside Isaiah and helped him press the final lavender plant into the soil. As the evening light settled warmly across Mercer Avenue, the repaired flower pot rested quietly near the porch steps where it belonged, and this time, nobody touched it.